don't need that. Okay, thanks. Well, I'd like to discuss some questions about a topic that goes back to classical antiquity, remains quite obscure in many ways, and has many significant implications, I think, which I'll try to bring out, or at least indicate. The question is, what is the fundamental nature of language? What's it for? What is it designed for? There's a simple classical formula, goes back to Aristotle, that language is sound with meaning. That raises three questions at once. What is sound? What is meaning? And what is with? The most neglected and most crucial question. There's been a good deal of discussion of sound over the past several millennia. A good bit is known. A lot of consideration of questions of meaning, how much is understood, one could debate, but virtually nothing about with. Presumably because it was assumed to be trivial, simply by association. So a child sees a cow and somebody says cow, and an association is set up between that thing over there and the word, and out of that spins the meaning. That doesn't survive much examination, but even if it did, it wouldn't begin to touch the real question, which has to do with the fact that a number of associations of that kind, if you want to call them associations, is unbounded. So it can't be set up by experience. That's the with problem. It's very rarely been noticed in the whole history of thinking about language. Occasionally it has. Galileo was maybe the first to point out a pretty obvious fact that the language our language capacity has infinite scope. He described the alphabet as the greatest invention that had ever been made, because it enables us with 25 letters to express any thought that might come to our minds. Notice that he's not accepting Aristotle's dictum exactly. That's a description of language as meaning with sound, which is not quite the same as sound with meaning. In fact, differs in interesting ways. This is picked up not long after by Descartes, and in fact for Descartes it's the foundation, one of the foundations of his dualistic science. This interesting and long story, also mostly ignored in the history of philosophy, but I think quite crucial. After that it kind of languishes. It picks up again in the 20th century, partly because the concept with came to be understood in the 1930s and 40s with the development of the theories of computability, Turing, Gödel, Kline, others. The notion of a finite characterization of an infinite class became well understood. And that makes it possible to ask ourselves what would be the nature of the sound-meaning relationship, whatever it is. Well, the basic answer has to be that there's some kind of what's called generative procedure, finite computational procedure, that determines the structures and the interpretations for an infinite range of categories, of expressions. And the interpretations have to be dual, one for sound, one for meaning. Apart from that, for anyone who's not a mystic, this capacity is internal to us. It's generally denied, but a lot of mystics around. But clearly it's something internal to us, mostly our brains, which means it's effectively, the capacity is effectively an organ of the body in the rather loose sense of organ that's used conventionally in biology. Some subsystem of the organism that has enough internal integrity so it can be studied on its own and interacts with other such modules, systems, subsystems in the functioning of in the life of the organism. So that should be uncontroversial. Unfortunately, it isn't, but I'll put those controversies aside. Well, we've learned in recent years that the concept sound is too narrow. The externalization of language, the form in which it reaches the outside, seems to be modality independent. So it can be visual, it can be sign, it can be touch, a lot of interesting work on that, and so on. There seems to be some internal analytic capacity that's common to any form of external expression. Now, that already suggests to us that maybe Aristotle's dictum should be inverted, just as Galileo's observation does. Maybe it should be meaning with not sound, but some form of externalization. Well, I'll keep the sound here just for simplicity, but I mean any form of externalization. If it turns out that this distinction between whether language is sound with meaning or meaning with sound it bears on many other questions. There is a debate over what's sometimes called the essential function of language. We'll come back to that notion in a minute. There's a traditional view, which in fact is Galileo's, that language is primarily an instrument of thought. The great 19th century linguist William Dwight Whitney expressed the traditional conception this way. He said, language is audible thinking, the spoken instrumentality of thought, which means that speech, sound, any other externalization is kind of a secondary property of language. The fundamental property is the internal construction of indefinitely many thoughts by this generative procedure, we'd now say. That's different from a contemporary view, which is so widespread as to be virtually a dogma, namely that the function of language is communication, and it evolved out of communication systems. The matter hasn't been studied, but I suspect that this modern view, which is in fact a dogma, you just can't question it, is in philosophy, psychology, linguistics, is probably a reflection of the grip of associationism and behaviorism. It's a 20th century doctrines, which have a very tight grip. Even those who reject them fundamentally accept them, I think. It also relates to a highly oversimplified view of modern evolutionary biology, which is totally different from what evolutionary biologists believe, but is also widespread. Interesting topic, another one I'll put aside. Looking at the general question, the question of what an organ is for, what's its function, is far from clear. So take any system you like. Say, take the spine. What's its function? Well, its function is to hold the body up, to protect the nerves, to produce blood cells, to store calcium. That's what it does. So which one is its function? Maybe all of them, or you pick one somehow. Well, the way one is usually picked is by evolutionary considerations. Which of those various uses is the way it evolved? You can give arguments like that about the spine, but you can't really do it about language. There's a huge literature growing all the time on what's called evolution of language. If libraries full of it now, last 20 or 30 years mainly, which is very curious in a number of ways. For one reason, it's curious because the topic doesn't exist. Languages don't evolve. They change, but they don't evolve. That's quite different. Evolution means change in the genetic basis for language, what's called universal grammar, UG, in contemporary terminology. It's also interesting to compare the huge library of speculations, and they are speculations, about what's called evolution of language, really means evolution of the capacity for language. Compare that with incomparably simpler topics, like evolution of the communication system of bees. By any measure, that's a far simpler question, but it's barely studied in biology because it's recognized to be too hard. On the other hand, evolution of the language capacity, which is incomparably more difficult, not only because of the complexity, but you don't have fossil evidence and so on. You know, that's a huge topic. Now, actually, a little bit is known about it, not very much. And what is known is suggestive. I'll come back to what it indicates. The one thing that is known with considerable confidence is that in the past roughly 50 to 80,000 years since humans left Africa, our ancestors left Africa, there's been no evolution of the language capacity. It's stayed identical. And there's very strong evidence for that. There's no difference that's detectable in capacity for language, any language, in a Papua New Guinea uncontacted tribe and you know, Dublin. Children are interchanged. They'll grow up the way their society is. And that seems to be true of cognitive capacities generally. If there are group differences, they're so subtle that they're virtually undetectable. So that tells us that something, at least, the UG, the language capacity, hasn't changed, hasn't evolved in roughly 50,000 or more years. With less confidence, but some, you can suggest that if you go back another 50 or 100,000 years before that, there probably wasn't any language at all. You look at the archaeological record. Of course, we have no fossil record, but if you look at the archaeological evidence, there is a sudden leap in creative activity, sometimes called the Great Leap Forward by paleoanthropologists, roughly around 75,000, 100,000 years ago, somewhere in that neighborhood. And it's you know, complex tools, complex social arrangements, numerical development of numerical representation of planetary, you know, celestial events and so on and so forth. It's generally assumed, sort of plausibly, that's connected with the emergence of language, which with human language, which differs radically along any dimension you can think of from from any communication system that exists in other animals, primates, and so on. Well, these are among the reasons. Of course, everyone would like to know something about the neural basis for language, but it's very difficult to explore the topic. One reason is it's unrelated to any other systems that are known. So we know a lot about the human visual system, but that's because the human visual system is quite similar to the visual systems of, say, monkeys and cats. And rightly or wrongly, we allow ourselves to carry out invasive experimentation with other organisms. So you can learn about their visual systems. That tells you something about ours. So something about the neurophysiology of the human visual system is understood. But that's not going to work for language. There just are no other organisms. So there's no other one to look at because there's no analogous system anywhere in the biological world. There's kind of very weak analogies, you know, with birds and ants, but it's evolutionarily so remote, can't possibly tell you anything. So the comparative study is out, and we don't allow ourselves to do invasive experiments with humans. You can think of all kinds of possible experiments that could teach you a lot, but you can't carry them out. So that means research in this domain has to be sophisticated and indirect. Some things are learned, but not a lot. Nevertheless, I think it is possible to say something about the essential function of language, the core property of it. But the way to do that, the only way I know, since comparative evidence is out and neurophysiological evidence is limited, there's some, I'll mention some, but there is a way to do it, and that's to look into the way in which language design. What kind of a system is it when you investigate its character? And another way of approaching it is to consider questions of communicative efficiency. What would be in a system that is efficient for communication? Compare it with design of language, and in particular compare it with questions of computational efficiency. There is an assumption here. The assumption is that however language developed, it satisfied, it's a computational system, so it satisfied general principles of computational efficiency, which are not specifically linguistic or even biological, maybe laws of nature. So granting that assumption, for which there's a good deal of evidence, not only in this but in other domains, we can ask about computational efficiency and communicative efficiency and ask how they interrelate. Well, I think considerations of that kind, I'll barely have a chance to hint at them, do suggest quite strongly that the traditional view is correct, that language is an instrument of thought, informally, and that the modern dogmas about language and communication are just wrong. Communication is a use of language, of course, but there's plenty of other uses as well. And it's secondary. It's not really a critical part of language, and not particularly specific to language. You can communicate in all kinds of other ways, style of dress, how you comb your hair, facial expressions, innumerable ways to communicate. Language, of course, is one, but nothing special about the connection. Well, these questions began to take a clear form approximately 60 years ago, when there were the first serious efforts to try to actually construct generative procedures, computational procedures that would meet the minimum condition required, namely generating an infinite array of structured expressions which have an interpretation in these two interfaces, as they're called, meaning and externalization, sound. And as soon as those attempts were made, some very puzzling phenomena were discovered. That's commonly the case. When you begin to look at some topic closely, it turns out that everything you believed was wrong. Actually, that's the classic moment of the origins of modern science. So for millennia, scientists had believed that there are simple answers to the question why if you let go of a rock, it falls, and if you release steam, it rises. They're going to their natural place, and how do objects interact through sympathies and antipathies. How do you perceive a triangle? There's a triangle over there, and a form flits through the air and gets into your brain, and there's a triangle in there, and so on for a range of questions. These were the conclusions of the best scientists, literally, for millennia. When Galileo and others began to agreed to be puzzled about these phenomena, instead of just accepting them, it immediately turned out that all your intuitions are totally wrong. You know the rest of the story. That's how science starts. That's how discovery starts, and intelligent inquiry starts in any domain. It's been very hard for this to penetrate to the soft sciences and the humanities. It just isn't grasped right to the present day, even in fields close to the sciences, like in this domain, computational cognitive science, totally misunderstood. But the ability to be puzzled is a pretty important one to try to cultivate. It's the core property, the thing that things should learn from infancy up through graduate school and beyond. One puzzle about language that came to light about 60 years ago and is still very much debated and bears on the question I was raising, it has to do with a very simple but rather curious fact. So take, say, the sentence, instinctively eagles that fly swim, and ask yourself what instinctively goes with. Well, it goes with swim, not with fly. Or similarly, suppose you raise a question and you ask, can eagles that fly swim? Well, the can goes with swim, not with fly, which is a curious fact because a computational procedure is involved which is quite complex. There is a minimal distance relation that is true of the actual linkage, but it's minimal structural distance. It's distance, it's the closest, the two things that are closest to each other when you look into the structures. And that's a computational, complex computational problem. On the other hand, if it worked the other way, through proximity instead of structural distance, it would be a trivial computational problem. You just check the closest verb to instinctively or to can, and that's the one it's associated with. And that's elementary computational problem. But language doesn't use the simple computation. It uses a complex one, which ought to be puzzling, and is puzzling, I think. And it's not just true of these examples, it's true of every construction that's known in every language that's known. So there's something far-reaching about it. The general principle, minimal search, closest distance, that's all over the place in language, and probably it's just kind of an effect of the general property of minimal computation that I mentioned. In this case, there is some supporting evidence from neuroscience. One of the most interesting experimental results in neuroscience has to do exactly with this. It's work done in Milan. For those of you who are linguists, the linguist involved is Andrea Moro, other biologists. They investigated the following paradigm. Take, say, speakers of German, and give them two nonsense languages, invented languages, one of which satisfies the properties of, say, Italian, which they don't know, and the other is designed to violate principles of universal grammar. So in this connection, take an invented language in which you negate a sentence by putting the negative particle after the third word, let's say. Language does it in a much more complex way with using structural distance. Well, it turns out that for the case of the nonsense language that satisfies UG principles, you get normal brain activation in the language areas. For the case that violates UG principles, like having negation as the third word in a sentence, you get a lot of brain activation all over the place, and people can ultimately solve the problem. But it's evident that they're treating it as a puzzle and not as a language problem. There's also some evidence, some of you may know this, from observation of cognitively impaired but linguistically capable subjects. Neil Smith's work with his famous subject, they did dry experiments like this and compared with normals, and you find pretty much the same thing. Well, that yields a suggestion, a possible explanation for the curious fact that a child reflexively uses structural distance, minimizes structural distance, and ignores the much more simple computational process of linear distance. The assumption would be that linear order is simply not available to the language learner. who's confronted with examples like the ones I mentioned. Rather, the learner is guided by a UG principle, a principle of language capacity, which simply says there is no such thing as linear order. It's just there's only structural properties, and you have to minimize those. And that conclusion has caused a lot of consternation in the cognitive sciences. There's actually a small industry in computational cognitive science trying to demonstrate that you can get these results by statistical analysis of massive amounts of data, paper after paper on that. Every approach that's clear enough to look at fails irremediably. Furthermore, it wouldn't make any difference if they worked, because they're not dealing with the right question. Suppose you could show for the cases in English that I mentioned that you could somehow, the child could learn this by statistical analysis of data, which is totally impossible. But suppose you could show it, it would be totally meaningless, because the question is, why does language do it this way? Always, not just for these cases, but every case, not just in English, but in every language. Why does no child ever make a mistake about it? Why is it basically reflexive? And that question wouldn't be addressed even if, impossibly, some of these approaches worked. Papers keep coming out about it. And that's actually a good illustration of the unwillingness to be puzzled that has to be overcome if science is even going to begin to take off. Well, a more far-reaching thesis is that linear order is never available for computation in the core areas of language, in syntax, sentence construction, and semantic interpretation. There's actually considerable evidence for that in other domains too. It seems that structural properties like, say, hierarchy play a role, but order does not. Languages that have, say, almost mirror image word orders operate exactly the same way. This suggests that the linear order is only a peripheral part of the language system. And you can understand why it's there. The sensory motor system requires it. So you can't speak in parallel, let's say, and you can't speak in structures. You have to speak in a sequence of a linear order of words. So linear order has to be imposed somewhere in other arrangements. But it looks like it's just a reflex of the sensory motor system. Well, one of the few things that's known about evolution with fair confidence is that the sensory motor system was around for hundreds of thousands of years before language ever emerged. Doesn't seem to be adapted to the language system. Apes, for example, have approximately the same auditory system as humans, and even focus on the same kinds of phonetic features, phonological features that are essential for human language. But of course, when they hear language, it's just noise. They don't hear anything. Actually, there's another striking curiosity that's almost never been studied. Again, a failure to be puzzled is how come an infant, a one-day-old infant, can pick out of all the noise around them some subpart which is language-related. It's a very tricky task if you think about it. If some other, even an ape, let's say, with essentially the same auditory system, is presented with the same noise, it's just noise. But for an infant, it's not noise. Some scattered part of it is language-related, and that's reflexively picked up and goes on almost reflexively to gain the capabilities we're now using, including such properties as the one I mentioned, that you can't use linear order in the internal computations, despite the computational simplicity of it. Well, that suggests already that we should probably return to the traditional concept of language. the concept that Galileo, Descartes, and others expressed, that Whitney articulated in the form I mentioned, and recognize that externalization altogether is a peripheral part of the whole language system, just reflecting accidental aspects of the sensory motor system, which we have to use for externalization. And of course, it would follow from that that particular uses of language, like communication, are even more peripheral and secondary to basic language. And all the extensive speculation about evolution of language is just off the mark to begin with. You can throw out the libraries for this reason alone. Actually, there is evidence from, some evidence from the limited evolutionary evidence around that conclusion's correct. I won't have time to go into that. Well, if there were time, I would, and there isn't, I would go on to give some more complex examples which require a little more thought and attention. But when you look into more complex questions of semantic interpretation and communicative efficiency, what you can show pretty convincingly, I think, that the design of language directly yields the basis for semantic interpretation, but constructs problems for communication. It introduces properties into what is pronounced that cause a lot of what are called parsing problems of perception and so on. There's many examples of this. In fact, every case, I won't have time to go into it, but every case that's known of a conflict between communicative efficiency and computational efficiency, that is best language design, every single case that's known, and there's quite a variety, communicative efficiency is just disregarded. Hands down, always computational efficiency, that is good design for semantic interpretation, wins out. And that tells you something quite general. I'll skip a lot of stuff because there's no time. Suggests, apart from the particular conclusion here that the modern dogmas are probably all off the wall, that communication is not a fundamental part of language. It's very peripheral, along with other uses, that the language is designed basically as an instrument of thought. It developed apparently very quickly, some small rewiring of the brain, maybe 100,000 years ago, which is nothing in evolutionary time, simply provided the computational procedure, simple computational procedure, which answers the question with, except that it modifies it in that the externalization part is secondary, a matter of adapting it to a sensory motor system that was all around. But a kind of a more general point that I would kind of like to bring up, and I won't go into, but you can think about, is that if you make close attention to rather technical properties of the nature of language, specific technical questions, they can lead to conclusions that have quite far-reaching ramifications about the nature of our fundamental mental processes and the consequences of considerable significance, I think, for the human sciences, even in their currently barely developed form. So let me stop there.
Okay. Richard. Thank you, Professor Chomsky. Thanks. I'm a former UCD student and currently studying in the UK. I'll start off by just saying I don't want to be a mystic if I can help it. Moreover, I see how I'm supposed to be softened up by your remarks about scientific revolutions to the point about communication not being the function of language that people originally thought. But could you perhaps say a little bit more about how it is that, or why it is that externalization has this effect that it does, and why, and where is the principal, perhaps, barrier to externalization as opposed to the hierarchical?
Are you asking a question about the way people think about it, or
no,
about the modern dogma, or about the facts?
Well, I'm asking a question, perhaps, why the dogma is a dogma.
Why the dogma exists?
Yeah, why? Yeah.
Well, I think, as I said, it hasn't been studied, but I think it's pretty obvious. The 20th century underwent a shift of attitudes towards humans and their actions and so on. Basically, associationism and then general behavioralism. So you go back 50 years ago, psychology was called behavioral science. Sociology was behavioral science. Everything was behavioral science, which is a very, it's the time when I sort of was in grad school. I was one of a few people who thought this is pretty crazy, even without knowing any conclusions. I mean, to call, say, psychology behavioral science is like calling physics meter reading science, because the data for physics is reading meters, and that some of the data, not all of it, some of the data for psychology is behavior, not all of it. But it means that looking at the field as a study of data, not as a study of whatever the internal structures are, and that just doesn't make any sense. Combined with this was something else. Right about this period, computers were being developed, actual working computers. And it was widely believed, and still is, that sooner or later there'll be these massive computers with very rapid processing, and they can deal with huge amounts of data and carry out some statistical procedure on the data, and something miraculous will come out. It's still very widely believed. And people are very misled by it. In fact, there's something called the Turing test, which you've probably heard about, which every year there's a competition. If you win it, you get $100,000 to pass something called the Turing test. A totally meaningless task. It's supposed to show, can you show that machines think? It's all based on a paper of Alan Turing's, who was a great mathematician and one of the founders of computational science. And there's an 8-page paper that he wrote in 1950 on whether machines can think. But he starts off the paper by saying the question whether machines can think is too meaningless to deserve discussion. That sentence has somehow been ignored in the entire literature. And there's a good reason for it, because to ask whether machines think is basically asking what kind of metaphor you like. It's like asking, do submarines swim? Well, from a certain point of view, you can say so. From another point of view, not. But it's not a meaningful question. He proposed this imitation game, which is now called the Turing test, but he proposed it for a different reason. He said it'll be interesting the idea is to see if you can construct a program that'll delude a blind observer, one who doesn't see what's going on, to not be able to distinguish the program from a person. Okay. He says it'll be useful for trying to, as a challenge, to create bigger machines, better machines. Okay, maybe so. In fact, probably was. But it doesn't tell you anything about whether machines can think. In fact, the whole idea of machines thinking is posed in a way which is almost designed to cause confusion. I should say that the people who are confused by this are some of the leading philosophers, the most influential philosophers, and scientists and others. It's not a trivial thing. I won't mention names, but many of you know. For one thing, a machine, the computer itself, is maybe useful as a paperweight. It doesn't do anything. What is doing anything is the program that you put into it. Okay, so the real, if you want to pose the meaningless question, it should be, can programs think? Well, what's a program? A program is just a theory written in a crazy notation so that a computer can implement it. So the question really is, well, can this theory think? In other words, is this a theory of thinking? Well, you know, the answer is not unless you understand something about theory of thinking. Nothing's a theory of X just because it passes some meaningless test. You know, it's a theory of X if it gives you some insight and understanding into the nature of X. So the real question is, are the theories that are written in these programs giving us some insight into the nature of thinking? And as soon as you pose that question, you don't even bother with the prize, because of course they're not doing anything. These things combined, the associationist psychology, the behavioral turn in the human sciences, the availability of data processing, they all combined to lead to what, in my view, is just massive confusion in all the fields related to these topics. That's probably the reason. I mean, you know, you have to look at individuals and ask, but I think if you do, you find something like that. And it's right to the present. I mean, it hasn't changed in the least. Yeah.
Cathal?
Cathal O'Madigan, staff in the School of Philosophy in UCD. So you want to suggest, I think, if I've understood you correctly, that the function of language is thought, not necessarily communication. And so I'm just wondering, so some linguistic things that we do, or the practices that we engage in that we'd be inclined to call linguistic, are speaking to one another. Speaking to one another, also correcting each other's use of language. So if I point at a duck and I say, look at the lovely pigeon, somebody will say, that's not a pigeon, it's a duck. Right? So we try to get our language use to conform, so we're all speaking, using the words in the same way. Do you mean that kind of thing is far thought? And if so,
I mean, it takes place, but if you just think about it for a minute, probably 99.9% of your use of language is internal. It doesn't involve any other people. So you can't, it takes a tremendous active will not to think to yourself in language. It's almost impossible. Every minute of the day you're talking to yourself. When you sleep, you know, doing the same thing. There are cases of the kind that you describe. There are all kinds of uses of the system, just like there are all kinds of uses of the spine. But that doesn't tell you much. In fact, if you really look closely, this has not been studied. There's another dogma here that's blocking the study of this. It's a dogma that in the modern period actually goes back to pretty much to Quine, and then it's picked up by John Searle and others. The idea that there can't be anything in the mind that is not available to introspection. Nothing can be in the mind unless it may not be conscious, but it's got to be available to consciousness. Otherwise, it's not in the mind. That's totally hopeless. Most of what goes on internally is completely beyond the level of introspection. For example, the case that I mentioned. I mean, the principle, which is pretty well established, that linear order is not available for syntactic and semantic computation. You can't introspect into that. It's not conscious. The same is true of just visual perception. For example, one of the most interesting results in the study of visual perception is a conclusion that came out of David Marr's lab, Shimon Ullman's principle, what's called the rigidity principle. They were able to show that if you present a subject with tachistoscopic presentations, you know, it's a screen with a couple of dots on it. If you have successive presentations, not many, maybe 3 or 4 presentations of a few dots on the screen, what you perceive is a rigid object in motion. Okay, that's pretty curious too. In experience, you have no experience with rigid objects. Throughout all of human history, till very recently, there weren't any rigid objects. Like if you walk in a forest, no rigid objects around. But somehow the system, it's probably true for other, it hasn't been really tested on other organisms, it's hard to test, but it's probably true for apes and cats and so on. Our system is just designed to impose rigid objects in motion on virtually no data. And that, by now, the mathematical properties have been worked out, the neurological properties less known. But again, you can't bring that to consciousness. And I think the same is true of speaking to yourself. Try it sometime. Think about what you're actually doing when you talk to what you call talking to yourself. I think you'll find that what's actually in your mind consciously is just fragments. Little fragments flit by. And out of those fragments, you can suddenly construct a sentence, a meaningful sentence. And that meaningful sentence is probably being constructed unconsciously, beyond the level of consciousness, internally, by whatever these generative processes are. And bits and pieces of it reach consciousness, like a couple of fragments of phrases. And that's what we call thinking to ourselves. And by now, that's, that seems to be true in other domains, too. There's some, by now, famous experiments, the Libet experiments on decision-making, which have been widely misinterpreted. But what was found was that if you decide to do something, say I decide to pick this up, milliseconds before I decide, something's going on in the motor areas, namely the right organization of motion to pick it up. Well, the immediate conclusion that was drawn from this is, okay, that shows there's no freedom of will. It doesn't show anything of this sort. What it shows is that everything that's going on is beyond the level of consciousness, which we know in every other domain too. But as long as philosophy of mind is going to be bound by this dogma that you can't go beyond what's available to consciousness, or else it's not in the mind, it's never going to discover anything. And I think, and there's a whole collection, and I think that dogma too probably goes back to behaviorism. I mean, it's pretty clear in Quine's case. It's Quine, you may remember, distinguishes, it says actions can be in accord with principles or guided by principles. That's all. In accord with principles means like the planets following Kepler's laws. Guided by principles means you formulate what you're going to do and then you do it. And say virtually all action doesn't fall in any of those categories, either of those categories. And with John Searle, it comes up as what he calls his association principle. Has to be available to consciousness somehow before it can be attributed to the mind. And spins off a whole theory about rules and so on. But that's just approaching these questions with your hands tied behind your back. And I think the same is true of the considerations that you mentioned. They're real, but it's very peripheral to the use of language.
Can I ask a quick follow-up?
Yeah.
Okay.
So does that mean, I suppose more centrally what I was maybe thinking is whether you think that if you were raised without an external language, without a shared language, so your desert island thought experiment.
What would happen?
Yeah, is that person...
Well, there's actually some evidence about this. There are... The most striking evidence is studies, there's a couple of studies of children who were found whose deaf children whose parents had been indoctrinated into what's called the oralist tradition, which is very common until pretty recently. That is that deaf children should not be allowed to learn sign language because they have to be part of the general society, so they have to learn how to lip read. It just makes no sense at all by now, at least in sensible areas. That's all been dropped. But that was a major dogma for a long time. And there were parents who were, one famous case of a couple of, three cousins in Philadelphia, who, student of Lila Gleitman's, worked on it. Three cousins who'd played together, little kids had played together. Three were deaf. Their parents were so indoctrinated that they didn't even gesture to the kids because they didn't want them to be misled into developing signs. So when the kids were discovered, it turned out that they were chattering to each other in a sign language, which is at the expected level of development for a 3-year-old, you know, a 4-year-old. Same structures, everything the same. So they'd essentially invented their own language out of no data. Actually, this had been noticed much earlier by Eric Lenneberg, who, one of the, the person who really founded modern biology of language. He was a fellow, we were friends back in grad school. And at the time, he was interested in language deficiencies. So he went, one of the things he did was visit the school for the deaf, this famous school for the deaf and blind in Boston, Perkins Academy. He went just to observe, see what's going on. And they were all strictly oralist. You know, that was the dogma. But he noticed that if the teacher turned to the blackboard, the kids would start signing to each other, like the kind of things that kids do if the teacher isn't looking. And obviously they had developed their own sign language, and were just using it when they weren't under control. Well, you know, in those days you couldn't publish anything like this because it was so counter to everything anyone believed. So it never got published. But since then, when the topics become legitimate, there's other discussions like that. Now, let's take the case of somebody who has no input at all. Okay. There are a couple, that's the Wolf Boy case. Well, the chances are very strong that the language capacity would never develop. But that's normal. I mean, take, say, the visual capacity. Remember, in the case of vision, we can study cats and monkeys, and we know what happens. So if you take, say, a kitten, and in the first few weeks of life, it's deprived of structured visual stimuli. So like it has a ping pong ball over its eye, and all it gets is diffuse light, but nothing structured. Then the neurological basis for analyzing visual systems just degenerates. It's not even there anymore, so they're never going to learn how to see. And that's true of just about every capacity. They tend to have what are called critical periods, periods in which the capacity has to develop or it'll never develop. And again, we don't do experiments with humans, but if you did, you'd probably find that there are indirect evidence to indicate that there are several critical periods in which if the system is not stimulated somehow, it's not going to function. I mean, most of us have an experience with this. For almost all adults, there are individual differences, but for most adults, it's extremely hard to learn a second language. Infants do it reflexively, and a 10-year-old will do it reflexively. But for older people, it's work. I mean, if one of you were to go to a foreign country with your 10-year-old child, you would discover that in a couple of weeks the kid is jabbering fluently, and he doesn't care. Maybe the kid doesn't even want to be there. I have that experience. But they just can't help it. They just learn speak the language like a sponge. On the other hand, the adult can study and take classes and work hard on it. It's not easy. And probably some critical period has been passed. There is one case that's been actually studied carefully of a girl who's called Jeannie. If you look it up in the literature, G-E-N-I-E. You have to be careful about the literature because there's a lot of popular literature on it, which is pure garbage. But there's also some technical papers. There's a woman named Susan Curtis, very good cognitive neuroscientist who worked with Jeannie, and her papers tell the story straight. What happened with Jeannie is that she was found when she was, I think, 13 years old. She was up in an attic, tied to a chair. Some psychotic parents, and they would shove food in occasionally. She could pick up the food and eat it, but she had no. They tried to deprive her of any external stimuli, so nobody ever spoke to her, that sort of thing. When she was found, of course, she was rescued, and there were efforts to try to help her. And Susan Curtis was the therapist, actually, who took care of her. And it looked for a while. They were, among other things, she turned out to be quite bright. She could learn all kinds of things. And she learned very quickly how to delude people. She was apparently very manipulative. She could make people think she was doing all kinds of things which she wasn't doing. And for a while, they thought that she was acquiring language. But it turned out to be an illusion. She was acquiring ways of deluding the people around her into thinking she could use language. But with closer analysis, it turned out she could overcome that barrier. Now, you can't really be sure what that means, because a kid who's been raised in those circumstances is going to be totally psychotic, so naturally. So how much of this is just general psychosis, and how much is deterioration of the language faculty? You can't tell. To do that, you'd have to do invasive experiments of the kind that you can imagine, but we can't do. That's the kind. Actually, there's another kind of evidence that is quite interesting, and has never been. Take Helen Keller. Okay, Helen Keller was blind and deaf, very fluent. She's a wonderful writer. All kind of interesting ideas. And, no difficulty in expressing herself. She learned. What's claimed is that she learned by touch. Okay, her teacher, Aunt Sullivan, spelled out words in her hand. It's recently been discovered from photographs from that period that Helen Keller actually had invented a technique that is now used for teaching the deaf-blind. The technique is to put a hand on the face, and your thumb is on the vocal cords, so you can tell if the vocal cords are moving, and your fingers on the face, you can see the way the face is moving. So you get a minimal amount of data. But now that's been studied. Actually, my wife worked on that at MIT. And there are subjects who've learned this system who are pretty fluent. Nobody's ever reached the Helen Keller level, but it's pretty fluent, which is pretty amazing itself because there's almost no data. However, there's something else that was discovered, and there were too few cases to publish anything about it. But the few cases that worked, they found that every case that was successful, the person had lost sight and hearing after about 16 months, 18 months old. What happened? These are cases of spinal meningitis. Now it's curable, so it doesn't happen anymore. But where there was sudden loss of both speech and hearing and sight. And if they were more than roughly that age, then they could gain fair facility. And Helen Keller was 20 months old when she lost sight and hearing, and she gained, perfect fluency. Before that, there weren't any successful cases. Well, that suggests something. It suggests that by, say, 18 months old, kid already knows the whole language. They're not exhibiting the knowledge, but anyone who's paid attention to children know that they know a lot more than they can exhibit. They're understanding all kinds of things, and they don't seem to be able to do anything. And it's perfectly possible that by, say, that age, the child has actually acquired the major aspects of language, and that the Tadoma, the method that I mentioned, is just kind of eliciting it, eliciting something that's already inside. Now again, if you could do direct experiments with humans, you could test this. But of course we can't, so you have to look at indirect evidence. But I think the evidence points in that direction.
Thank you. Jamal?
My name is Jamal Rohana. I'm at Linguistics in UCD. I have many technical questions I would like to ask you, but if I could ask one general question. Since language is hierarchical and system of externalization is linear, then there is of course a non-trivial question of how you convert a hierarchical system into a linear system.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could say a few words about that.
That's a good question, and I didn't hear who you were, I'm sorry. But is your background linguistics?
Yes.
Well, then you know
He's the
the
professor of
answer.
linguistics.
There's a lot of work on it, like Richie Kane's work on LCA, for example. There are various ideas about how a structured system can be mapped into a linear system and what are the principles that do it. And there's some quite interesting ideas, pretty far-reaching. But it's a real problem. It's a real question. And it's only been asked in recent years because it was only recognized to be a problem in recent years. Now, if you go back to Saussure and Bloomfield and the great modern linguists, they didn't see it as a problem. So for Saussure, it's all association, and in fact, Saussurean linguistics didn't have a concept of sentence. Sentence is somewhere in a boundary between langue and parole. It doesn't fit anywhere. For Bloomfield, language is just the collection of expressions that can be used in a speech community. The same as for Quine, and it doesn't mean anything. But as long as you look at the problems that way, which is pretty much like scholastic physics, sympathies and antipathies, going to your natural place, then you're never going to see any problems. It's when you start asking what it means for what kind of a set is it that's the expressions that can be used in a speech community. When you start asking those questions, that everything suddenly becomes very puzzling, including this question, which is a very live one today. What is, it raises all kinds of questions like how do Japanese and English yield linear order when they seem to have opposite structural orders?
There were two questions there, Paula.
Hi, so I'm Paul, I'm a student at Trinity. So I agree with you in sort of the rejection of this dogma of having externalization of use as prior to thought. And that also opens up sort of an interesting avenue. For now we have to think of a new way to have semantic interpretation.
Of semantic interpretation?
Yeah, because now we have to leave sort of the standard view of having what we're looking for are sort of the objects of the locutional act and so on. Now, one person who sort of also shared this view would be Jerry Fodor. Though he's been saying sort of in a couple of places lately that he finds your views on semantics puzzling is the word that he chooses. And the last decade or so, he's been trying to say, well, the way to go about is by having informational semantics and then try to find some causal relation between the outside world and the mental representations. I mean, you've been emphasizing a couple of places that mental representation doesn't require mental representation of. I know that you've been saying a couple of places that mental representation doesn't require mental representation of something. And I agree with that too. But I still share something about sort of Fodor's puzzlement, that at some point we have to have, some thoughts have to have aboutness, and they have to be about something at some point. So if Fodor finds your views puzzling, what do you think about his approach to do this?
Well, we're old friends for 50 years, and we found each other's views puzzling for 50 years. In fact, it's reciprocal. In fact, when I mentioned about cows and the word cow, I had Fodor in mind. His view is, you know his view. He says exactly what I said. A child sees a cow, somebody says cow, that sets up the connection, and from then on, the sight of the cow causes causal relation of the mental image or notion or whatever it is, cow. And that simply does not stand up to examination. As soon as you begin to look at words, incidentally, this was pretty well understood in the 17th century. So if you read the Locke, Hume, the English Platonists, others, they understood that our concept, if you like, of an object is not individuated by identifiable physical properties. So you read Locke on person, for example. It says persons, he didn't put it in these terms, but if you look at the kind of thought experiments Locke carried out with what if you have two minds in the same body, that kind of thing, what he's actually saying is that our concept of person is based on some notion like psychic continuity. Okay, psychic continuity is not a physical property. It's not something a physicist can discover. It's something that we're imposing on the world. It's like the rigidity principle. In fact, for Locke, he says person is what he calls a forensic concept. It carries with it notions like responsibility and rights. Well, you know, physicists can't look at an object and say, okay, he has responsibility and rights. Actually, this is known in the history of philosophy. There's a recent book on it by Galen Strawson, who brings up these things. He unfortunately doesn't refer to the history about them because nobody knows it. But that's correct, and that's just true of everything, including cows. So you can quickly make up simple thought experiments that show that notions like cow are also based on psychic continuity, among other properties. In fact, there's some part of this that's very familiar to everyone. Fairy tales. Infants have no problem understanding fairy tales. It's easy, you know, but just think of the standard fairy tale. You know, the wicked witch casts a spell on the handsome prince and turns him into a frog, let's say. And for the rest of the story, the prince has all the physical properties of a frog, all of them. Then the beautiful princess kisses the frog and becomes the handsome prince again. That means it always was the prince. Didn't matter what its physical characteristics were, because what makes it a person is this strange property of psychic continuity that runs through the whole thing, always. And you can do the same. There's similar stories with animals, you know, turned into something and then turned back into themselves and so on. And children have no problems with that. That's perfectly straightforward because their concepts are simply not based on physical properties. Of course, in part they are, like you don't distinguish, you know, say a cow and a house or something, but it's only a small part of it. Most of our concepts, even of the simplest notions, are pretty much like the rigidity principle. You see them a certain way because of the way you interpret the world, and you can't get that by association and causality. So I think Jerry's approach is, it's not just him, everyone's, is hopeless from the start. In fact, I think if you look closely, I think you find that in human language, there really is no notion of reference or denotation. There's ways of interpreting the world based on our internal conceptual systems, but they do not set up a relationship between an internal symbol, like a word, and some mind-independent entity, which was what reference or denotation would have to be. And in fact, if you look at the history of philosophy, some of the famous conundrums have to do with this. So take, say, the ship of Theseus, you know, Plutarch's story. The story is that Theseus is on a ship in the ocean, and there's a variant of it, and one of the boards rots, throws the board overboard, overboard, replaces it by a different board. This keeps going until finally every board has been replaced, and it's still the ship of Theseus, although all the physical properties have changed. Well, the conundrum comes when you add, say, that there's somebody on the shore who's picking up the old boards and putting them back together and rebuilds the original ship. Which one is the ship of Theseus? Nobody has an answer. And the reason is our cognitive systems are not designed so they can deal with a question like that. Actually, I tried this out with a ridiculously small sample of my grandchildren once. They made me watch some space program, Star Trek or something, where they have there's a device on the spaceship in which a person can go into it and be transported somehow, reconstructed on another planet. Okay, so nobody has any problem with that. But then I asked them, what would happen if the person who was reconstructed on the other planet was still in the box that he went into? Which one would be the person? That's the ship of Theseus. They were kind of stuck with that. They thought about it, had different answers, but basically had no answer. And I think if you look at Kripke's puzzle, it's pretty much the same. The puzzle dissolves if you don't assume that there is an entity, a mind-independent entity that words like London or Paderewski and so on are referring to. But if there is no such relation in language, then the puzzle can't be formulated. And of course, there are going to be questions you can't answer, like which is the ship, or which is the person in the box. But there's no reason why you should be able to answer them. Why should our cognitive systems be developed so that any question you come up with, we have an intuitive answer to? No, they're not. Those are the traditional puzzles. And to find out why they're unanswerable, we have to look into the nature of our conceptual systems. And I think it's here that ideas like, say, Jerry's just founder right at the beginning, because there is no way of, try just about any word you can think of, no matter how simple, you'll find that the concept is individuated by non-physical properties. Actually, this was noticed by Aristotle. Aristotle talks about it, he talks about it in metaphysical terms. So he asks, what's a house? What's the definition of house? He doesn't say the definition of the word house, the definition of the thing. This is in the metaphysics. And he says the definition of house is a combination of matter and form. Okay, so the matter is boards and bricks and stuff like that. And the form is what it's used for, what the design is, things like that, which are, this was all later reconstructed in the 17th century in epistemological terms. This is the cognitive structures without Aristotle's metaphysics anymore of matter and form. But I think the basic idea is right, that what constitutes a concept for us is some combination of things we perceive and constructions that we impose on it by our complicated cognitive systems, for which things like psychic continuity and design and use and so on are critical. Now, if there's something that looks like a house, say, but it's used to store books, it's a library, it's not a house. And this holds of every term you can think of, river, tree, almost everything, maybe everything. Everything has been looked at.
Thanks. Aisling?
Hi, I'm Aisling Green from Trinity College Dublin, philosophy. So you started off with sort of some science of meaning, and this is really interesting. And then you sort of, part of your explanation for this is that there are certain semantic structures in the head. And one of the things that drops out of your view, it seems, is that while communication is a use of language, it's not an essential function of language. But I was wondering, on your view, whether you would think that communication can become essential when we've got kind of other people involved. So when human beings want to cooperate with each other, it might turn out that, say, when I see someone's facial expression as a smile and it's meaningful, and I say, and then I ask myself, well, are they smiling at me because, you know, they agree with what I'm saying, or perhaps they're smiling at me because they think what I'm saying is slightly ridiculous, or there are all these possibilities for how I interpret their smile, their smile, and so then it becomes essential for me to kind of talk to them and ask them, is this what you mean by your smile, or what you're saying, or perhaps your you know, this piece of writing? Once there are other people around who we want to cooperate with and we want to understand, it can become, language can then become essential.
Well, here you're using what do they mean in Paul Grice's sense.
Yeah,
what do they intend? It's not really meaning, it's intention.
Yeah.
He tried to unite them, but I don't think that worked.
Okay.
But here it's a clear case that's normal in interaction with other people, or even what you read. You try to figure out what's intended. You don't pay much attention to the literal meaning of the expression. I mean, of course, that gives you a hint, but you're really trying to figure out what's going on in the person's mind. What are they trying to convey? And that's a pretty tricky operation, as you know. But and a lot of things come into play, you know, background assumptions, where the person's coming from intellectually, you know, what are your shared beliefs. So it's a complicated social action, which of course takes place all the time, and language is part of it. But notice that the literal meaning of expressions, well, as you say, is only one piece of the puzzle. I mean, if the person's talking Swahili, you can't do this. But if the person's talking English, a language you know, you can instinctively and reflexively, you know, no thought, grasp the literal meaning. And that's one factor that enters into your trying to determine what the intention is. But the kinds of things I was talking about just are the stuff that's going on reflexively, the literal meaning. And that has quite interesting properties. And I think even the look at the literal meaning shows that communication and other language uses are peripheral to the system. Doesn't mean they're unimportant, just maybe they're very important for human life. Incidentally, I think communication is a pretty bad word for this kind of social interaction. I mean, if communication is supposed to have some meaning, it has to do with transmission of information. But most of our interaction with other people isn't transmission of information. Like, you know, you're talking to somebody at a party, let's say, or you're not trying to transmit information, like doing all kinds of things. Or you're standing at it's very hard for people to be near each other and not to talk. If you want to really embarrass people, put them in a closed room and ask them not to talk to each other. I mean, it's very threatening. You just can't do it, you know. Try it sometime. So you're kind of forced to talk to the people, you know, at a bus stop. You talk to the person who's next to you. But you're not conveying information. You're just maintaining some kind of social interaction that's comfortable. So I don't think it should be, even those things should be called communication. It's, again, the idea of using communication comes from this kind of instrumentalist approach to this study of psychology and sociology. Everything has to be for some, you know, purpose or something, well, to achieve something. But most of our use of language, even with other people, isn't achieving anything more than maintaining pleasant social conditions, you know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is it okay if we go?
Yeah.
Okay. So there are two questions here. The lady in the second row.
My name is Edna Guilfoyle, Dublin City University. I'm a linguist. I'd like to ask a question about modularity of mind and some of the ideas that you're speaking about here, in particular the structural properties of the linguistic system. Is that specific to the linguistic system, or do you think that's related to other parts of the cognitive system? That's my first question. The second one is a bit, I guess, maybe more trivial, but for those individuals who don't have language for whatever reason, who fail to develop, is there a cognitive impairment as well? Would you see that?
Is there a cognitive
impairment as well as a consequence? Like, how related are those two things?
Well, first of all, about modularity, we have to make a distinction between two interpretations of that concept. The one that's in common use, actually, is Jerry Fodor's, he's talking about modularity of processing systems. So it's the input systems that are modular, he's arguing. And it would have to be extended to output systems, of course. According to him, what he calls the central systems have to be unstructured, Quinian, isotropic. You know? So there can't be any structure to the input systems. That does set up a problem. So, for example, why do you hear English and speak English? Why don't you hear English and speak Japanese? I mean, if the systems are unconnected, why is that the case? Well, there has to be structure for the central systems. And here you get a different notion of modularity, a notion of modularity that's more related to acquisition than processing. So given all the noise and confusion around you, how do things get sorted out into different systems? Well, that's where the internal system of modularity arises, and I think that's where your question comes. So what are the connections between, if any, between the internal linguistic system and other cognitive systems? It's an interesting question, and the way to, there are other languages, every group of humans that's ever been discovered has essentially the same kind of language. But there are other common properties that are found, like music. Just about, I think every society that's known, you know, uncontacted, so-called primitive, you know, hunter-gatherer tribes, they always have some kind of music, you know, drumming, whatever it may be. I think they almost always have dance. That seems to be universal. These things just have no function at all. You know, like what's dance for? But children pick it up instantly, kind of automatically. Every society has it. And you could ask the question whether, another thing that every known society has is arithmetical capacity. Now there's a lot of misleading information about that. Now, it's often claimed that you know, Aboriginal groups don't have arithmetic, but that's based on the fact that they don't have number words, or they may have number words that only go to 3 or 4 or something. But this was studied carefully by a really outstanding linguist, Ken Hale, about 40 years ago. He's one of the founders of Australian linguistics, and he did study languages which don't have number words. But he found that the people, first of all, they have other ways of expressing numbers. Like maybe they don't have the word 5, but they can go like that, and other ways of doing it. He also found that if these people are introduced into a market system, you know, they start selling and buying, they can do all the computations immediately. So they must have the whole number system. And the same appears to be true about color systems. Like a lot of the systems is well known that, you know, there are languages that don't have color words sometimes beyond black and white. But as he found with the Australian Aboriginal groups, They have other ways of expressing it. So they may not have red, but they can say blood-like, you know. And so the whole conceptual system all seems to be there. The arithmetic is particularly interesting because where that comes from is an old problem. Actually, that goes back to the origins of evolutionary theory. So Darwin and Wallace puzzled about the fact that all humans, they didn't know all the data, but they were right, that all humans have arithmetical capacity. And that's a puzzle for them because it wasn't selected. It's never been used. So there was no selection. In fact, using the arithmetical system is very recent and very restricted to small groups of people, but everybody's got it. So where'd it come from? Wallace, in fact, thought that there has to be some other process in evolution beyond natural selection. Darwin didn't like that, so they debated it. What I think the answer in all these cases has to be that these things are kind of piggybacking on systems that are already there for some reason. In the case of arithmetic, if you look closely at language design, at the elementary computational principles that enter into the generative procedure, they actually yield arithmetic. If you take those procedures and you take a system with one element in the lexicon, call it one, it yields arithmetic. So arithmetic just could be piggybacking on the system that's already there. But what about music? There is work, some interesting work, trying to show that the basic properties of musical systems are similar to the structural properties of linguistic systems. There's quite interesting work on that, and maybe that'll come out. Dance, you could try this. Actually, Nelson Goodman tried to do something with dance. But I think these are really good questions, because you have to ask, where do these things come from? In the case of language, we have no idea where it came from, but you can imagine a way in which it could have evolved suddenly, some slight rewiring of the brain, then maybe the other things just spin off it. Or maybe there's some other origin, but that's a good question. But in order to study it, you have to accept the notion of modularity that is not used in the philosophical literature. Not input modularity, but rather central modularity. And that's what's explicitly denied by Fodor and implicitly denied quite generally.
Thank you.
Hello, Dr. Chomsky. I'm a student of linguistics in UCD in my third year. One of the things is when you mentioned the cow, I was suddenly reminded I went to a coffee shop just before I arrived here, and somebody's looking for the toilet door, and they were indicated to a bookshelf that is the door. And so in a sense, I'm surrounded by toilet doors in here. It's a beautiful building. So that idea that what a door is assumed to be, that it looks like something else, but still functions
as a function of the door. It's a door.
Very similar to your cow.
Yeah.
But I was interested as well in the idea, I believe he was a student of yours before, of Lakoff's conceptual metaphors, and the manner in which we should use or think about language in how it presents ideas. So Lakoff's, for example, of conflating to rising prices, etc. And in the manner as well that has almost become a way in which ideas are espoused through political systems. So the Republicans as the father figure, etc., that type of idea. So at what point does language then, should we think of language as a way of producing thought, as an interaction with the mind, and then a system of communication that's used to present ideas that go beyond what we think about? I don't quite have that question straight in my own head. But can something like a conceptual metaphor be reflective of a thought process, or is it the other way around?
Well, there are what sound like serious questions about whether language depends on thought or thought depends on language. But in order to study those questions, you have to clarify what you mean by language and what you mean by thought. And the fact is there's very little to say about thought, except insofar as thought is expressed in language, which undercuts the investigation. We have to find a way to think about thought that's language independent, and that's not easy. I mean, you could do it in other domains, like, you know, imagery, visual domains. How do you find your way home at night, things like that? Well, it's some kind of thought. A lot of it can't be expressed in language, but this is no theory of thought. And until there's some kind of a theory of thought that's independent of language, it's going to be very, very hard to even pose the questions. So it's a traditional question, but it's one of those questions which I don't think we're in a position to formulate because we don't understand what we mean by thought. This is where the misinterpretations of Turing play a role. So good questions. I just don't know how they can be formulated yet.
So I think we have time for one more question. Paul Elburn. Maybe, Paul, you will introduce yourself, even though I mentioned your name.
Well, since Maria has just already done that, I work at Queen Mary Westfield College in London. I'd like to ask you, Noam, about something that you said in response to a couple of questions back, namely about words not having real-world reference. I suppose what I'd like to point out is that some of those cases seem to be cases that are not accessible or not easily accessible to consciousness. So, for example, the word house, you pointed out all these strange features of it, both now and in your writings, but I think it really takes, you know, someone to point out those kinds of features before people realize them. With other examples, though, I think the oddness, or, you know, let's just say the fact that these phrases don't have real-world reference seems more easily accessible. So, for example, another sentence of yours, I think it goes something like, the bank moved across the road after burning down.
Yeah.
Which seems at first like a perfectly straightforward sentence in English. We can all more or less reconstruct the train of events, but then when you reflect on it for just a second, you think, huh, that's funny, you know, there can be nothing, no real object can have A, burned down and then moved across the road, which is the point of the example. So my question is, at least for the latter kind of examples, how is it that we are able to use those sentences so easily to convey truths? Because it seems on first inspection at least that, you know, if a sentence either asserts or presupposes the existence of an object that does not exist, and indeed in many of these cases an object that could not exist, it seems on first inspection like they should either just come out false, or that they should come out as, you know, presupposition failures.
Actually, I should mention that Paul is the only person who writes on semantics who takes any of this seriously, so it's unique. But I think what it means is just that most of what we do is unreflective. It's kind of like seeing a rigid object in motion or seeing the moon illusion, or understanding other people. We have the slightest idea how we do it. We can't introspect into our own behavior any more than we can introspect into falling bodies. I mean, it's just intuitively obvious that if you have two objects of different mass, the one with a larger mass is going to fall faster. Well, this turns out to be false, but it's, if we can't introspect into something as simple as, say, falling bodies, or why some things fall and others rise, how can we hope to introspect into anything as complicated as what the human mind is doing? You've got to study it from the outside, the way you study other things. And when you do, it's very hard. There are illusions about, one of the main illusions in the goes through all of intellectual history, is that somehow we ourselves ought to be the easiest thing to study because we can look into what's going on. So, say, Tom Nagel asks what it's like to be a bat, and nobody can give the answer. But try answering the question, what it's like to be me. I mean, I don't think anybody can answer that question either. At least I can't. You can't pose questions like that. They don't mean anything. To figure out what it's like to be me, or a bat, or a nematode, or no matter how simple it is a hard scientific question. And to ask what it's like to be a person, even yourself, is maybe one of the hardest questions. You can write novels about it, or write poetry about it or something, but you can't give a discursive account. Just can't answer the question. I think we can't hope to answer the kinds of questions that you're talking about just by introspection. Somehow when people use the word bank, let's say, they automatically understand what you just brought out. And they don't find it confusing unless you point out to them, look, this technically doesn't make any sense. And then you get things like, say, Kripke's puzzles. But the puzzles arise because you're trying to present in a rational form that's somehow objective things that are handled by people in a totally different way.
If I may ask a very
sure. Yeah, go ahead.
So I guess
he gets a special dispensation because he takes this seriously.
Paul gets special dispensation.
So I guess my worry is that does this commit us to the existence of two systems that are capable of analyzing sentences like that? There's I guess the normal semantic interpretation system, which is indeed inaccessible to consciousness, as you say, but then there's this other faculty by which we come along and say, that's funny.
Yeah.
But it seems that this other faculty is itself doing some kind of semantic analysis of those sentences. And so we seem to be left with a kind of, what words from the on the face of it look like a slightly ontologically costly system, whereby we have two systems that can do some kind of semantic analysis.
Well, I think we have to set up two different systems. There's our many different systems. In fact, I think there's probably a high level of modularity in the mind. One of our capacities, we call it a science-forming capacity, which every has in some fashion, is to try to make sense of our experience in a coherent way. I mean, Russell once pointed out that the only thing we're really confident about is our own immediate experience. And the rest of inquiry, including all of science, is to try to give some coherent account of what this experience is. And I think that's basically right. This science-forming capacity, which children use to make sense of the world, that primitive tribes use and so on, is just a different one. It's also trying to make sense of the use of language. So for example, when a child, let's say, if present you in a Piagetian type experiment where something moves and something else moves, the child will automatically set up an invisible contact between them. There's got to be some invisible mechanical thing that's causing them to interact, because that's just the way we see the world. In fact, that's a major event in the history of science. It was when Newton showed that it doesn't work, when he demonstrated that what was called then the mechanical philosophy, the assumptions about the nature of the world that were made by every great scientist, Galileo, Leibniz, Descartes, Huygens, everyone. And Newton himself, he believed it. That's why he regarded his discoveries as an absurdity, that no person with any scientific understanding could pay any attention to, but they just happen to be true, that you can't have a mechanical universe, that you have what he and others regarded as a kind of occult property, action without contact. It can't happen. And our intuitive way of understanding the world just happens to be different from the way the world appears when we apply our science-forming capacities to it. That was a wrenching moment. You know, in fact, it changed the whole nature of science. So for Galileo, the great scientist of the early modern period, the goal of science was to show that the world is intelligible. Post-Newton, it changed. It took a long time for it to sink in, but basically changed. We give up the hope of understanding the world. We just try to understand theories about the world, which is totally different. And you get, you know, apparent contradictions, like Hume, who understood this, pointed out that Newton's greatest achievement was to show that there are mysteries which we will never comprehend. He was referring to things like action without contact, interaction without contact. On the other hand, you get modern scientists and philosophers like David Deutsch, David Abraham, many others, in fact, generally, who condemn what's called Mysterianism. That is, there are things that we cannot comprehend. That's Dan Dennett, lots of others. This is some kind of pathology, because in principle we can understand anything. Well, what they're claiming is something quite, they have already internalized the change of the conception of science from trying to discover an intelligible world given up by the time Newton's discoveries sank in, to trying to discover intelligible theories. And maybe we can develop an intelligible theory about anything, about almost anything, maybe anything you can think of. But that doesn't mean that the world's going to be intelligible. So Mysterianism just almost has to be true. And it was proven by Newton, in fact. Though he didn't like it, he thought it was absurd. Hume recognized it, look, it's true, what can we do with it? Locke recognized it. So Locke, one of his great insights was, what's called Locke's suggestion in the history of philosophy, that he said that just as there are, he put it to theological framework, but we can extract it from that. What he said is, just as God added to matter properties which we cannot comprehend, like action at a distance, so God might have superadded to matter a faculty of thinking. It's the hypothesis of thinking matter, which was then, it kind of opened up the possibility of really having a scientific psychology. It was kind of dropped for a couple of centuries, but that's it, basically. And you have to try to figure out, well, what is the property of whatever's in there that allows thinking. But I think that gets right back to your question. We can, with our scientific capacities, we can look at this and say, hey, there's something really wrong here. We have to have another system for describing it which doesn't have these internal contradictions. And that's just a different system than what we call common sense, or ordinary ways of looking at things. And within that system, you can develop, in fact, you try to develop a notion of reference. So in, say, physics or linguistics or any other kind of organized inquiry, you hope that the entities that you construct, mental entities that you construct, symbolic entities, you hope that they actually pick out something that exists in the world. So if scientists think they found the Higgs boson, they would like to believe that there is a Higgs boson out there, And if linguists talk about phonemes, they'd like to say, yeah, there's something real that's a phoneme. But that's a totally different notion from the ones in our ordinary language. In fact, this leads to a lot of problems in contemporary philosophy, I think. Like, take the whole twin Earth discussions. or the idea that, you know, water is H2O, and all of those discussions. They're just mixing up two different systems. You can't ask whether water is H2O in natural language, say English, because it doesn't have the word H2O. That's from another system. You can't ask whether water is H2O in chemistry, because it doesn't have the word water. Of course, chemists use it informally, but they have H2O and not water. There's no, if you actually look at what water is in human language, it's a very complex notion. You know, it has nothing to do with H2O, of course. But so even, you can't even pose the questions that are discussed in the twin earth literature because of mixing two quite distinct systems. And it's kind of curious because the philosophers who develop these systems believe something that, you know, comes from Quine and Wittgenstein and so on, that that words don't have meaning except inside a language. Okay. Well, if you believe that, then if you mix up two languages, it's going to be incoherent. You know? And so you'll get what looks like a sentence, water is H2O, but water is getting its meaning from English, and H2O is getting its meaning from chemistry. And chemistry is a system which at least strives to have reference. That's the whole point of science. And English is a system that doesn't strive to do anything. It's just like walking. It's what it is. You know? And it doesn't happen to have reference.
So, thank you very much. We not only have used all the time allocated to this session, but have gone beyond it. And thank you, Professor Chomsky, for your generosity in answering all the questions. I think the Academy would like officially to make a presentation to you at that stage, and then we'll convey our thanks as a group. I would like to thank Professor Chomsky for this wonderful occasion, and thank you for coming, and Maria Bagramian and School of Philosophy at UCD for organising it very well. This is a book of our treasures in the Academy. Many of them are actually here, but also we have many treasures which are in the national museums and so on. You will be interested that so much of it has to do with natural philosophy, as it was called, early chemistry and so on. But there are very many beautiful things, and we're very proud to be able to say thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.